Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of ethereal stuff rather than sort of concrete and steel and the more physical elements of transport that I see a lot about. I'm probably going to go into a little bit about the technology that's driving our future mobility, and I guess it probably has sort of two or three themes. One is the connectedness that we need for vehicles, driven by what people want who are sitting in the cars, using phones and their mobile devices and their ability to manipulate those and so forth. Also the introduction of more safe technologies for vehicles, so making the vehicle more cognizant of its surroundings, of each other, of pedestrians, all that sort of thing. And I also want to talk a little bit about, I guess, how the wireless environment with respect to electric vehicles is changing how we can envisage what mobility will look like. And I sort of want to do that in the context of maybe 10 to 20 years in the future. And I always stop and check myself, because when you think of 10 years in the future, you think, yeah, that's sort of 2025, it's quite a long way away. But in fact, if you look back, it's only 2006. And in fact, we probably weren't that different in 2006. I remember, I think the All Blacks had only won one World Cup at that point. And we'll see what's happened there. Another thing that's changed quite dramatically too is the way in which we interact with devices and our personal mobility devices, wearables, all that sort of thing. And I think we're increasingly attached to our phones. And if you look at most people who are stood around in a public space, they're sort of glued to a little screen. And that's happening sort of inside the car as well as outside the car. And people are looking at their phones about 150 times a day. So that's about once every 6.5 minutes. So, pretty intensive sort of use of those devices. So, we're talking about really dealing with a generation of folk who are really born, mobile. And I think it's interesting that with the smart watches and wearables that, they're being looked at about 80 times a day. So not as much as mobile handhelds. And interestingly, at the moment, predominantly to tell the time. So I thought that was quite interesting that you go to all this trouble of making the watch do everything in addition to tell the time, but people still use it to see if they're late or not. What I'll go into first is just a little bit about Qualcomm as a company, because some of you might not know who we are. We started about 25 years ago. We are predominantly in mobile communications, but that is becoming a bigger and broader area. Started off doing digitising communications, so with CDMA and 3G from analogue, and then redeveloping how we do computing and moving that much more into the mobile space from the desktop. And we're now set for a new stage of growth, and that growth is broadening, I guess, where we have connectivity and where we do our computing and what other devices and technologies are using connectivity. And they are, I guess, loosely termed the Internet of Things or the Internet of Everything, but more focused on things like smart home, wearables, and of course, automobiles. And I think one of the great things that is being enabled by this connectivity, and automobiles especially, is our ability to deliver safety and really address some of the issues that we have with transportation. It's interesting that we are taking, and I was thinking about this on the cab ride here, very long cab ride in fact, that the word automotive and mobility, when you bring them together, it sort of comes back to what we traditionally referred to as the car, which is the automobile. And it's interesting that the technology is tending to converge too, and what we carry in our hand and how we drive is really sort of starting to become one, and those technologies are looking to be shared. And I think if you look at some of the automotive companies who have entered into the fray to develop technologies which maybe could have been done elsewhere, they are starting to realise too that maybe one of the easier things to do is allow the technology to develop with the people who are good at it. And I think that one example would be Ford with development of sensing in both seats and steering wheels for vital signs. They had a big program of R&D for that, and then backed out of it because they recognised that it was probably easier to do it on a wearable. You had people like Apple and Samsung doing it. The problem is not of vital sign mapping and stuff is not really specific to the car. It's helpful when you're in the car, but you also need it as soon as you step out. So maybe just have an interface between the device and the car and let it be developed. So those sort of things are interesting in seeing how the industries are sort of converging as well as the technologies. And what we are seeing is a major intersection, if you excuse the pun, between those technology developers. And historically, I think automotive companies have been quite closed in terms of who's allowed to play in that car space. And I think we're seeing that open up a little bit. We're seeing the ability for us to hop inside a car with our phone and have that automatically connect, download all of our contacts, all of our music, even use things like Spotify to get music real time, and really give us that sense of, personalisation. There are also a stack of other things which are happening within the car as well, in terms of sensing and so forth, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, which bring us to a position where cars are going to be a lot more connected and more safe. One of the things I think to recognise is that this is coming from different directions. A lot of the demand or the expectation is coming from the drivers and the users of the vehicles themselves. Big numbers of people wanting safety and diagnostic information on their phones. A lot of people, 40% of people really looking at technology within the car as a major selling point. And I mean, I'm talking about people buying a Tesla and having it download firmware overnight rather than being sort of locked and only being upgraded when you take it in for a service and that sort of thing. They're becoming front of mind selling points for people. And having a set of safety technology within the car is also key. And that's becoming more important, I think, when people are making buying decisions. I think the trend that we're seeing with is that people are, because they have an ability to sort of manipulate or personalise or upgrade their own devices, they're expecting that to happen in the car as well. And so people are sort of, expecting to be able to sit in the car and have their own apps in the interface, get their own news from their own feeds, get their own music, stream video to the kids in the back seat, etc. And that requires a whole stack of integration of different technologies. And those of you who know how we develop technology for smartphones is that we put more and more services on the chip. So the chip stays as the central core, and in the vehicle I think you've probably seen a divergence from that in terms of the number of ECUs that are appearing in the car. It's quite different to how to develop a phone or a mobile computing device where you stick more and more stuff in the central core. It works faster and cooler and the interfaces are quicker. So this is a lot of driving a lot of the way we're doing work with automotive chip development. It's also interesting that the car companies are recognising the pull from users, and it's changing the way they think as well. And here's a quote from Ricky Howdy from Audi, really talking about how the vehicle, with its sensing and with its actuation and with its convergence of processing, is becoming a much more sort of integrated device. And that's something that when we complement the standard technology on a vehicle with other sensing and other connectivity, we open up a huge array of potentialities in the vehicle. One of the things that we do need if we're trying to make a vehicle more cognizant of its surroundings and therefore able to assess where pedestrians or cyclists or motorcyclists or other vehicles are, is connectivity to the cloud, and that gives us an ability to real-time assess where vehicles are in the development of those, I guess, levels of awareness that we think the vehicle needs. Some of the elements I think are worth noting in terms of a temporal aspect too, because if you look at the development of the cloud-based connectivity and computing and software services versus how cars have developed and versus how some of the apps within the vehicle have developed, a lot of them are crossing over, and there are things like navigation, where having a navigation system where the maps are loaded when you buy the vehicle and then updated maybe once a year. You've probably all experienced being sent down an alley where you've got to reverse out of it, or the ability for navigation systems to be updated real time and for people's vehicles to sense things like black ice, for example, or traffic congestion, and feed that up and then back to vehicles coming further down the track is super important, and it really makes the whole potential sort of living, breathing ecosystem available to us. And as we see this sort of coming together of the different ecosystems, from information like navigation stuff that I just talked about and entertainment, it's interesting that some of the devices that we've been developing for one or t'other are actually, when you put them together, work quite well. And that allows us, I think, to develop pretty advanced vehicle systems, which I'll go into some of the benefits of those in a sec. I think the development of certain attributes from, say, telematics and infotainment, which are sort of static, which are, I guess, closed to the user, is one thing. But if we move into looking at mobile devices and our ability to configure them and personalise them, I think that's quite another thing. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a real desire for people when they're buying vehicles to be able to get in amongst the interfaces on the vehicle, upgrade their own systems on there, and even put their own apps into the vehicle. So there's both a convergence of different ecosystems and this sort of ability for the user to upgrade. And they're develop or driving, I think, quite dramatic changes within the cockpit of the vehicle. And if you take a view of a car, very dramatically different from what it used to be, but this is not too hard to visualise now. I mean, maybe you go back 10 or 15 years, it may have looked a little bit sci-fi, but most people could imagine either having sat in the back of a car with two LCD screens and kids watching videos or playing games, the navigation happening on the front of the car, and also other screens in the car which could be doing other things. Or they could even be integrated, and kids could be sharing social networks on the screens together, playing games, tweeting, all those sorts of things. And for that to happen, you really need convergence of and integration of those services on the chip which is sitting in the car driving all this. And if you're going to do that, you've also got an ability to also integrate other things like sensing data, like camera data, and that can help not only in terms of nav, but in guidance and lane control and that sort of thing. And I think when you imagine upgraded infotainment in a vehicle, it's a little bit like, I gather in this room, there's probably no two handheld devices which are the same. And what I mean by that is everybody has put their own flavour on it, their own personal, requirements for apps and information and what newspaper you want to read and all that sort of thing. And again, that is what we perceive as happening inside the car. So the ability for the car to accept that and for people to integrate with it is pretty key. And I think we'll see a lot more of that in the near future. Now, as we introduce these sort of vastly interactive technologies into the car, we also introduce a couple of problems. And that is that as people drive along in their car, interacting with those devices can be problematic. It can be distracting, and of course that can cause more problems than it solves. So the ability for us to change the way we interface with the car systems by gestures, by facial recognition, by eye movement and that sort of thing, eye tracking, is becoming quite important too. And those things, especially when if anyone's had a go on some of the gesture devices, they're quite amazing. I mean, you can just flick through like you would on a page through music, and you can very quickly glance at a screen and see a CD that you might want, or a playlist that you want, and flick through it and then hit a song that you want to listen to. And they are very important things rather than you having to really steer. You can do it quite quickly and safely. And I've talked about how the consumer is driving a lot of this development of technology, a lot of this pull of technology, but it's also coming from government. And the ability for, or the need rather, for governments to improve safety and response to accidents and those sorts of things is also driving another set of technologies. And so we're seeing mandates for, in the US, for things like DSRC, which is dedicated short-range communications. And that gives the vehicle an ability to do vehicle-to-vehicle communication, to be cognizant of where another vehicle is at an intersection. And that can be both another car, or it can be a cyclist, a motorcyclist, or even a pedestrian who has a device. And they can set up networks very quickly and establish, proximity to each other, direction of movement, velocity, and then as the vehicles move through intersections, those networks dissolve, and then the car goes on its merry way. And I think if you think about how many deaths are caused globally, and it's over 1 million people get killed every year in car accidents, which we perceive are being avoidable. This is a pretty crucial set of technologies. Some of the technology embedded in the systems that we need to develop this DSRC tech is now being shifted onto the chip, and Qualcomm have been working very hard to get DSRC functionality as a service on a chip into our automotive Snapdragon chips, which really facilitate some of this pretty cool stuff. Now that's to prevent accidents, but I think we are a wee way away from a world where there are no accidents or there are no automotive failures. So being able to notify emergency services of an accident, of an issue in a vehicle is important too. And so the European authorities are developing a mandate for eCall, which is emergency calling, where the vehicle calls the emergency services if it has an issue, if it's crashed, and it has a whole lot of data already. It knows where it is, the velocity of the impact. It can probably tell whether airbags have been deployed. So it can give the emergency services quite a lot of information as they set out, especially with respect to positional data. Now I just want to change topics slightly because I've talked all about sort of technology in cars and connectivity and that sort of thing. I want to talk a little bit about what other aspects of the vehicle and modes of ownership and modes of transport that allows us to develop, and also some of the other issues that we're trying to solve collectively. One of the things that putting a load of sensing and a load of processing of that sensing on a vehicle allows us to do is have cars which are super cognizant of their environment and other vehicles, as I mentioned. So it's not a big stretch to imagine that they can therefore drive themselves and pilot themselves. So when you stick a load of LiDAR, radar, camera-based sensing on a vehicle and process it very quickly, plus have cloud connectivity, you now have a vehicle which can in effect drive on an open road itself. And I think that's an area where we're going to see a huge level of development. It's also an area where the technology is wanton. I think when I use the word intelligent mobility, it would be a bit remiss of me not to touch on another area of transport, which is the pollution and tailpipe emissions that are inherent in the petrol and diesel vehicles. And obviously there's been plenty of stuff in the media recently about that. One of the solutions that we have before us is the electric powertrain. And one can imagine if you start combining a lot of these things together, having a self-driving vehicle which needs a human to refuel it is a little bit of an anathema. So as we go towards a future of self-driving vehicles, it's likely they're going to be more electrified. So therefore it's needed that they are charging automatically too. And it also brings us a benefit in the cities in which we're living, where we've got predictions of some 70% of our population living in cities by sort of 2050, allowing us to really reduce emissions and clean up the air quality. And as we think about what a city street would look like, and I know for a lot of highways folk this causes palpitations as you start sticking more stuff into the roading infrastructure rather than keeping it as a nice architectural structure without cables and the like. But having an ability to put power into a vehicle as it moves along a track and know where it is on the road to a much more fine proximity is very key for us to develop a future roadmap for these vehicles. So really, just in close, I think if we imagine we take connectivity, the ability to really enhance what goes on inside the vehicle, what the vehicle's ability is to sense its surroundings and other vehicles proximate to it, clean up the tailpipe emissions by electrifying and charging those sort of vehicles wirelessly, we have this sort of picture of mobility in the future which is electric, connected and wireless. As we move into even deeper levels of cognition, we can imagine with machine learning that the cars become much more intelligent. So not only intelligent because they can sense and respond, but intelligent because they can also learn. So we end up with a vehicle which is much safer, much cleaner, and of course much more connected. So I'll just leave you with that. I thank you for your attention, and I think we're in a very interesting time, and we look forward to having some conversations as we sort of work towards a future of more connected and intelligent mobility. Thank you very much.